Hello and welcome to lesson 7.3C. I've entitled this video, Slavery in the South. This video is going to cover pages 439 to 442. Slavery in the South. The life of enslaved African Americans was determined by strict laws and the practices of individual slave owners. Conditions varied from plantation to plantation. Some owners made sure their enslaved workers had clean cabins, decent food, and warm clothes. Other planters spent as little as possible on their enslaved workers. Here are a couple of pictures of some of the tools used on the slaves. These do not look like very fun things to have to wear. Slave codes. Southern states passed laws known as slave codes to keep enslaved African Americans from either running away or rebelling. Under the codes, enslaved African Americans were forbidden to gather in groups of more than 3. They could not leave their owner's land without a written pass from their owner. They were not allowed to own guns. Slave codes also made it a crime for enslaved African Americans to learn how to read and write. Owners hoped that this law would make it hard for African Americans to escape slavery. They reasoned that uneducated enslaved African Americans who escaped their owners would not be able to use maps or read train schedules. They would not be able to find their way north. And now we can answer a couple of questions. Number 1, what are slave codes? Slave codes were the laws that the southern states passed to keep African American slaves from having basic rights. Number 2, 5 examples of things African American slaves could not do because of the slave codes. All right, well, number 1, they were forbidden to gather in groups of more than 3. Number 2, they couldn't leave their owner's land without a written pass. Number 3, they were not allowed to have guns. Number 4, they were not allowed to learn how to read. Number 5, they were not allowed to learn how to write. Here are some examples of slave codes in different states. So notice this is from Georgia in 1848. Notice number 1 here. It says, capital crimes when punished with death. The following should be considered as capital offenses when committed by a slave or free person of color. So what this is saying is, if you're an African American slave or a free African American and you commit one of these crimes, you will be given the death penalty. Insurrection or an attempt to excite it. In other words, if you're trying to have a slave revolt, committing a rape, or attempting it on a free white female. Notice here, they put it on, if it's a free white female, then you can get punished for that. Or murder of a free white person, or a murder of a slave or free person of color, or poisoning of a human being. So these were all crimes in which you would be given the death penalty. You'd be executed. In Georgia, let's look at this one. Punishment for manslaughter. And in cases of a verdict of manslaughter shall be found by the jury, the punishment shall be by whipping at the discretion of the court and branded on the cheek with the letter M. So manslaughter is when someone is, their life is taken, but it's believed that it might be an accident, but still it's a life that is lost. Then the person, it's the slave that is found guilty of that, would be whipped until the court felt like that was enough, and then also branded on the cheek with the letter M. Yes, that is a hot stick with the letter M that they would press into your cheek and sear it onto your face. Punishment for slaves for striking white persons. For the first offense, you shall suffer the punishment as the said justice or justices shall have in their discretion they think fit, not extending to life or limb. In other words, they're not going to kill you for the first time that you strike a white person, but anything other than that is up to them. And for the second offense, suffer death. So the second time you get caught hitting a white person, you'd be given the death penalty. But in case any such slave shall grievously wound, maim, or bruise any white person, though it shall be only the first offense, such slave shall suffer death. So for the second time, you're guaranteed death. For the first time, you shouldn't get it unless they're saying that you wound, maim, or bruise the white person. Then they can give you the death penalty for that as well. Punishment for circulating incendiary documents. Incendiary documents would be documents that cause people to get upset about the slave system or make the slaves want to do something that would go against the slave system. For the purpose of exciting to insurrection, conspiracy, or resistance among the slaves, Negroes, or free persons of color of the state against their owners or the citizens of the state, the said person or persons offending against the section of this act shall be punished with death. So even though you didn't kill someone, if you got caught trying to get a slave revolt to happen, they would kill you. Punishment for teaching slaves or free persons of color to read. The said free person of color or slave shall be punished by fine and whipping or fine or whipping at the discretion of the court. So if you're caught trying to learn how to read or write, then they're either going to fine you which is silly considering that slaves couldn't make any money, or they would whip you, or both, and that was up to the court to decide. So trying to get an education would result in you being fined and or whipped. Punishment of free persons of color for harboring slaves. All free persons of color within this state, so free African Americans, who shall harbor, conceal, or entertain a slave or slaves, who shall be charged or accused of any criminal matter, or shall be a runaway, shall upon conviction, in addition to the penalty already provided for this, be subject to the same punishment as slaves are under this section. So basically what this is saying is, if you're a free African American in this part of this America, which is Georgia, and you're caught hiding or entertaining as some sort of slave who's charged with a crime, they're going to give you the same punishment. So those were just some examples of slave codes. And we can answer a couple. Number 3 there. Why did slave owners not want African American slaves learning how to read or write? Well, they didn't want them to learn how to read a map, so they wouldn't, or a train schedule, so they wouldn't be able to tell where they were going. Some laws were meant to protect enslaved African Americans, but only from the worst forms of abuse. However, enslaved African Americans did not have the right to testify in court. As a result, they were not able to bring charges against owners who abused them. Enslaved African Americans had only one real protection against mistreatment. Owners looked on their enslaved workers as valuable property. Most slave owners wanted to keep this human property healthy and productive. However, they would not hesitate to punish enslaved African Americans to keep them in line. So question number 4. Some laws were meant to protect African American slaves from the worst type of abuse, but why was it hard for the slaves to get any form of justice? Well, because they were not allowed to testify in a court of law, so they couldn't bring charges against the people who abused them. So you might say, oh, we're here to protect them, but they couldn't take anybody to court. Number 5, what was the only real protection a slave had against mistreatment? That their owners considered them to be valuable and they needed them healthy to keep them working. Frances Kemble, a British actress married to a Southern slave owner, kept a journal about plantation life. She wrote about who had the right to whip an enslaved person. Primary source, Frances Ann Kemble. The common drivers are limited in their powers of chastisement, not being allowed to administer more than a certain number of lashes to their fellow slaves. Headman Frank, as he is called, has alone the privilege of exceeding this limit, and the overseer's latitude of infliction is only curtailed by the necessity of avoiding injury to life or limb. The master's irresponsible power has no such bound. Hard work. Even the kindest owners insisted that their enslaved workers work long, hard days. Enslaved African Americans worked from, quote, can see to can't see, or from dawn to dusk, up to 16 hours a day. Number 6, what type of hours did the slaves put in working for their masters? Well, they could put up to 16 hours a day, or certainly from dawn to dusk. Family life. It was hard for enslaved African Americans to keep their families together. Southern laws did not recognize slave marriages or slave families. As a result, owners could sell a husband and wife to different buyers. Children were often taken from their parents and sold. On large plantations, many enslaved families did manage to stay together. For those African Americans, the family was a source of strength, pride, and love. Grandparents, parents, children, aunts, uncles, and cousins formed a close-knit group. This idea of an extended family had its roots in Africa. And now we can answer question 7. What part of Southern laws were especially cruel in regards to the families of slaves? Well, the laws did not recognize slave marriages or slave families. So the laws did not legally say that you had any sort of connection with any other African American slave. Number 8, an extended family is not just your mom and dad and brothers and sisters. It's also your other family, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. So that extended out family. And that was very important. Number 9, it was important for slaves because it gave them a sense of pride, strength, and love. And if one of your family members was sold away, you still had the other extended family that could give you courage and hope and love. Enslaved African Americans preserved other traditions as well. Parents taught their children traditional African stories and songs. They used folk tales to pass on African history and moral beliefs. Number 10, how did African American slaves preserve their traditions? Well, they taught their children traditional stories and songs and folk tales to pass on their history and their beliefs. Religion offers hope. By the 1800s, many enslaved African Americans were devout Christians. Planters often allowed white ministers to preach to their slaves. African Americans also had their own preachers and beliefs. Religion helped African Americans cope with the harshness of slave life. Bible stories about how the ancient Israelites had escaped from slavery to freedom inspired a new type of religious song called a spiritual. Yet, enslaved African Americans had to be cautious even in their religious practice. While they sang of freedom in spirituals, the words of the spirituals suggested that this freedom would come after death, so as not to alarm slave owners. So question number 11, what religion was important to the slaves? Christianity. Number 12, why was religion important to the slaves? Well, for a couple reasons. It helped them cope with the harshness of slave life. For number one, it gave them hope for an afterlife where in that life they would be free. And there also were examples in the Bible, including the Israelites who had escaped from slavery from the Egyptians, and it gave them hope that maybe one day they too could escape from the harshness and cruelty of slavery. How did enslaved African Americans resist their enslavement? Enslaved African Americans struck back against the system that denied them both freedom and wages. Some slowed the pace of their work, broke tools, destroyed crops, or pretended they were ill. Some passively resisted by learning to read and write. Others took much bolder action. So question 13, 5 ways that African American slaves fought back against slavery. Number 1, some of them slowed down their work, so they weren't doing as much as they could. Number 2, some of them broke tools. Number 3, some destroyed crops. Number 4, some pretended they were ill. Number 5, some learned how to read. And number 6, some learned how to write. Many enslaved African Americans tried to escape to the north. Because the journey was long and dangerous, very few made it to freedom. Every county had slave patrols and sheriffs ready to question an unknown black person. Question number 14. What were the 2 main reasons very few slaves that tried to escape slavery were successful? Well, number 1, the journey was long, and number 2, the journey was dangerous. And number 3, every county had slave patrols and sheriffs that were out to look for escaped slaves. Here's one example of a thing that they might make you wear if you had tried to escape or they thought you might try to escape. And notice this contraption would be hooked up to you so you couldn't take it off, and it would have a bell on it. So every time you moved, it would make a sound. Because Southern laws offered no means to resist slavery, a few African Americans turned to violence. Gabriel Prosser, an enslaved African American, pictured here on the left, organized an uprising in Richmond, Virginia, but it failed. Denmark Vesey, pictured here on the right, a free African American, planned a revolt in 1822. Vesey was betrayed before the revolt began. Both Prosser and Vesey were executed, along with dozens of their followers. Other armed slave revolts took a toll on both blacks and whites. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 resulted in the deaths of some 30 enslaved African American rebels and a similar number of white colonists. In 1831, an African American named Nate Turner led a major revolt. An enslaved worker on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia, Turner believed his mission was to take revenge on plantation owners. Turner led his followers through Virginia, killing more than 57 whites. For nearly 2 months, terrified whites hunted the countryside looking for Turner. They killed many innocent African Americans before catching and hanging him. And here when we look at history, we often see that point of view is important to understanding the events that have unfolded. Read the following 2 accounts of the events of Nat Turner's rebellion. So on the left, we have Nat Turner himself talking about it. And about this time I had a vision, and I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun was darkened, the thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams. And I heard a voice saying, "Let it come, rough or smooth, you must surely bear it." So there we see Nat Turner's description of what had happened. In this case, he's using religion as he heard a voice from God saying, this is what you should do. On the right, this is the Governor John Floyd of Virginia in a letter responding to the rebellion. "The course has been by no means a direct one. Northern traders began first by making the slaves religious, telling the blacks the black man was as good as the white, that all men were born free and equal, that they can not serve 2 masters. So in that case, you've got his point of view on the case. Notice 2 different takes on Nat Turner's rebellion that also try to throw in religion into the mix. Nat Turner's revolt increased Southern fears of an uprising of enslaved African Americans. Whites now became even more suspicious of the African Americans, free or enslaved. Southern states reacted to the revolt by further limiting African American rights. At first, the Virginia legislature seriously debated ending slavery in the state, but decided against it. Virginia then, like other Southern states, increased its restrictions on African Americans. Overall, organized slave revolts were rare. Because Southern whites were well armed and kept careful track of African Americans, an uprising by African Americans had almost no chance of success. So now we can answer a couple of questions. Number 15, what was the usual outcome of slave revolts? Miserable failures. Number 16, what effect did Nat Turner's rebellion have on the South? It made them scared and nervous and made them pass more severe, strict slave codes. Number 17, what were the two main reasons that slave uprisings had almost no chance of success? Well, number one, Southern whites were well armed, where African American slaves weren't even allowed to have guns legally. And number two, Southern whites kept careful track of African Americans, either on the plantation or with their slave patrols looking for escaped runaways. Well, thank you for watching. Before we go, this is a Halloween joke for you. What pants do ghosts wear? Blue jeans. Thank you and have a nice day.